going to talk today about the difference between classical or pre-modern politics and modern politics, with a specific look at the philosophical foundations and assumptions that are involved in the different conceptions of political life that philosophers of these different periods. On the ancient side, we begin, as with most ancient disciplines of philosophy, by putting metaphysics at the center. We make metaphysics really central to what we're doing. Specifically, the metaphysics of Aristotle holding that things have particular essences, there are substances, these things have natures that can be known. This Aristotelian-style metaphysics begins by observing that we live in a world of things, of substances, and that each of these things has a particular essence or nature that is appropriate to it. Including, what? Us. Human beings have a nature, and that nature is intelligible to us. It can be known by us. And just as by knowing canine nature, I can know what kind of environment and food and social structure a dog needs in order to flourish and be its most fully canine self, to realize its own canine flourishing determined by its nature. By understanding human nature, I get a plan for the type of social order that human beings need. Because human beings are a certain type of thing, and I can know with a good degree of certainty that they are that type of thing, I can determine what their flourishing is, what it means for them to flourish, and what conditions and social structures are needed for them to flourish. So I might, to take the example of domestic animals again, I might know that guinea pigs are social creatures. A single guinea pig will be less happy than a pair of guinea pigs, provided that they're compatible. So, to have my guinea pig be as happy as possible, I think he needs a friend. Same thing with dogs. You know, are they pack animals? In that case, in order to be most fully what they are, they need the social structure of the pack. If they're deprived of that, they might go on living, but they won't flourish to the highest degree possible. So in knowing human nature, I know what human flourishing is and what the conditions of human flourishing are. And that gives me a pattern for the social order. What I get out of this classical system is usually a hierarchical social order. Think back to Plato. Plato has his Method of Metals in Book 6 of the Republic. We have the idea that, well, who should rule the city? The people who are best able to rule the city. Well, who is that? Probably the people with the intellectual gifts, people from this gold class of citizens. People who just happen to, because of their natural gifts, be well suited to philosophical training and to becoming the sort of person who can acquire wisdom and exercise it appropriately to discern the good of the city and set policies and direction. Should the warriors rule? Not unless they have wisdom. Should the common people rule? That would be the worst of all, Plato says. Why would we have a democracy? Why would people who lack wisdom get together and we'd assume that the majority of them, combining all of their non-wisdom, would be able to select the wisest rulers? So we have, back to Plato's three classes of citizens in the city. We would have the philosopher kings, the complete guardians. We'd have the auxiliary guardians, the soldiers, people distinguished by courage and have a particular set of physical and mental gifts that dispose them to fulfill that role most completely. And then we'd have everybody else who can live out a life of moderation and justice under the rule of the auxiliaries and the philosopher kings, the guardians. So that makes sense. Everybody does the job they're most naturally suited to do. And that way, everybody lives out their own individual nature, and the social whole lives out its own nature and supports the others. So we have the same principles for ethics and for politics. Politics is just ethics on a large scale. They're both governed by our knowledge of human flourishing and the conditions for human flourishing. In fact, we get a kind of feedback loop here between the ethical virtue of the individual person and the social institutions that both are the fruit of that virtue and help to reinforce and train people in that virtue. We have individual virtues that help to create and sustain these social institutions, and then social institutions that reinforce and help to build individual virtue. This cycle is what I'll call, next week when we talk about John Stuart Mill, the politics of virtue. let's think about some concrete examples of this, both in the classical Greek polis, maybe in the time of Plato and Aristotle, and also in other contexts. What types of virtues must an individual possess in order to flourish most completely? Well, we have the 4 cardinal virtues. What other virtues does one need in order to contribute to political life? What virtues do we expect that somebody needs today to be a good citizen? Not only civic virtues, because they're virtues of a good citizen. A good citizen should be honest and not dishonest. So if I'm engaged in debate, I shouldn't be lying about my motivations, about my profiting or not profiting from a particular policy. I shouldn't try to manipulate people. I should be honest and straightforward with them, expect them to be honest with me. What else? Drive or dedication, caring, attention or earnestness in a sense. I want people to care about the result and not just concern. People be concerned about and attentive to politics to the appropriate degrees. This is regarded as something trivial. We can even say maybe there's an excess of concern where somebody builds their entire lives around politics. We say that's sort of going too far. So maybe there's an appropriate a middle amount of concern that somebody should have. Other virtues? One needs tolerance or respect, especially if we're going to be debating different policies, even in a fairly homogeneous political order like ancient Athens or Sparta, you would find sharp disagreements of opinion. We would need some sort of respect for process and tolerance of outcomes and opinions of individuals that we don't share. Maybe also rationality and a commitment to rational debate and process. I might say that would include a commitment not to use violence as a first resort when we don't get our way, especially in democratic politics. So we learn how to deal rationally with victory and with defeat. This is just brainstorming, so general ideas. The question would be, if these are the kind of virtues that help to generate and sustain a good political order, what kind of institutions are needed then to support these virtues? These institutions, these virtues, if people have them, will create or enable certain kinds of institutions. We think, again, we will think in our own place and time that we know best, which then ought to, according to this theory of politics, reinforce some of these things. So what kinds of institutions ought we to have that would both be supported by these and help to support these? Schools, especially schools that educate in civic duty. So we might think of the certain program of education that people should go through when they're young. Maybe we have student council elections in elementary school to give people an idea of what winning and losing looks like in a fairly low stakes environment. What kind of moves are allowed and not allowed in terms of political campaigning for office. You have the sort of mock elections that people would have among school kids, but also instruction in civic duty and the nature and limits of constitutional powers. All that makes sense. That's good. What else? Another one. Perhaps something like rule of law, or some consistently enforced procedures for deciding on political questions, whether they're democratic or some other fashion. They should be predictable. They shouldn't change arbitrarily from year to year according to who in power wants to win. Maybe some kind of limits on power. It'd be nice if we could find some way to reward honesty, maybe some kind of rewards for honesty in political dealing. You deal fairly with somebody even if you lose, that somehow come out better than if you had just lied your pants off trying to win and then lost. So some kind of, I'm trying to think of ways to make these support these. Because what's going to happen if this loop breaks? Just sticking with the ancient system here. Politics of virtue seems to require continuous formation. It requires the individual virtues to help form and sustain these political institutions, and it requires these institutions to function well in order to continue to incentivize and reward and create these kinds of virtues in the individual citizens. Suppose this feedback loop breaks. We end up with a set of institutions, maybe a different set of institutions that don't necessarily reward or support these things. What we have then is the system breaks down. We have a people that's less and less able to engage in the kind of activity that supports and sustains a flourishing social order. So the thing I wanted to get here with this circular diagram is that the virtues at the individual level both support and are supported by a certain set of social institutions at the larger, at the higher level. In order for this system to function well, there has to be a feedback loop where good institutions create good citizens help to create and sustain and shape good institutions. If that doesn't work, you don't have the virtue here, you don't get these, or if you have them, you don't hold on to them. And if the institutions don't reinforce or help to create in future generations, maybe especially for these schools, the citizens that have those virtues, then after a generation or two, you're going to have these institutions ready for profound change. They're just going to be sort of leftover relics of the previous era. So we've got some material here maybe for some political analysis next week. We'll look at John Stuart Mill, Politics of Freedom. Right? Two of the central, couple of central takeaways from this classical system before I erase and put up the modern system. It's our knowledge of human nature that's key. Because it's our knowledge of human nature that allows us to determine the rules of politics, the type of political institutions that are necessary to sustain human flourishing. It's the knowledge that we have of human nature that underwrites this entire system. If I don't have knowledge of human nature, or if human nature could change, be one thing in one era, a different thing in a different era, or if there's no such thing as human nature, it's just a philosophical superstition, then this entire system of politics is going to be ultimately ungrounded. It's going to not work. Second big takeaway, some of the central questions that would be asked by somebody working with this classical system of politics. What is the best way of life for human beings? What is human flourishing? How do humans flourish? What does human flourishing look like? What is the best lived life? Notice this was the subject of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which he also described as political science, the translation we used. And then, sort of consequent upon this, what flourishing is, what political and social institutions will help humans to achieve the good, the highest good of which they're capable. For a Christian thinker like Aquinas, that might include salvation. For a pagan thinker like Aristotle, that would include the life of active virtue. For Plato, it might include allowing the philosophers among us, that those very rare people, to achieve the highest degree of knowledge of the form so they can bring their wisdom then into service to polity. And everybody can live out their own particular vocation in life according to their own nature. So, but really, knowledge of human nature is the keystone, and it's when we take away that keystone that this entire system becomes unstable. We find from Machiavelli to Mill some profound changes over the course of a couple of centuries in political life, I already mentioned that this is the age where we enter the age of revolutions. Religion, science, industry, and social order, where the world we live in would be unrecognizable to our great grandparents. It was not the situation for most of human history.